Hello everyone and welcome back to WECN channel to our deep dive into blockchain fundamentals. Today we're going to explore one of the most critical and fascinating concepts in the world of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, decentralization. This is a topic that lies at the very heart of what makes blockchain so revolutionary, and by the end of this video, you'll have a thorough understanding of what decentralization means, why it matters, and how it's achieved in systems like Bitcoin. We'll also discuss the trade-offs, challenges, and mechanisms that make decentralization possible, all while keeping things clear and engaging. So, grab a notebook, settle in, and let's get started on this journey into the world of decentralized systems. To kick things off, let's set the stage by revisiting a concept we discussed in a previous session, Scrooge coin. For those who might be new here, Scrooge coin is a hypothetical cryptocurrency we use to illustrate some of the core ideas behind blockchain. Scrooge coin relied on public key cryptography, much like other cryptocurrencies, to ensure secure transactions. It also used a blockchain, which is essentially a ledger of all transactions, validated by a central figure, Scrooge. This setup allowed Scrooge coin to function as a basic cryptocurrency, preventing issues like double spending, where someone tries to spend the same digital coin twice. However, there was a glaring problem with Scrooge coin. It was entirely centralized. Scrooge, the central validator, held all the power. He generated all the coins, decided which transactions made it onto the blockchain, and could essentially hold the entire system hostage if he chose to. He could refuse to validate transactions, punish users by excluding their transactions, or even stop updating the blockchain altogether. Worse yet, Scrooge represented a single point of failure. If he forgot to publish updates, decided to retire, or was somehow removed from the picture, the entire system could collapse. This centralization made Scrooge coin vulnerable and far from ideal for a truly resilient cryptocurrency. This brings us to the big question: can we take the benefits of a system like Scrooge coin, secure transactions, protection against double spending, and eliminate the need for a centralized party like Scrooge? The answer, as you might have guessed, is yes. If you're familiar with Bitcoin or other blockchain-based cryptocurrencies, you know that decentralization is a cornerstone of their design. But achieving decentralization isn't as simple as flipping a switch. It introduces new challenges and trade-offs, and that's what we're going to unpack today. We'll explore why decentralization is desirable, what problems it solves, and what new issues it creates. We'll also look at how Bitcoin as a decentralized system addresses these challenges through clever mechanisms like distributed consensus. Let's start by exploring why decentralization matters. At its core, decentralization is about distributing power and control across many participants rather than concentrating it in the hands of a single entity. This idea isn't unique to cryptocurrency. It's a concept that appears in many areas of life and technology. Think about the difference between a centralized empire and a collection of independent city-states. The Roman Empire, for example, was highly centralized, with power concentrated in Rome. This made it incredibly strong and efficient, but it also meant that any disruption in Rome could destabilize the entire system. In contrast, the Greek city-states were decentralized, each operating independently. This allowed for a diversity of ideas and approaches, but it also made them militarily weaker compared to Rome. In the tech world, we see similar dynamics. The Apple ecosystem, for instance, is highly centralized. Apple tightly controls what software can be sold on its platform, creating a curated but restrictive environment. The Android ecosystem, on the other hand, is more decentralized, allowing a wider range of apps and developers, but sometimes leading to inconsistent quality or security issues. Even in computing history, mainframes represented centralized power. Massive, powerful machines that were difficult for individuals to access, while personal computers distributed computing power to the masses, albeit with less raw power per device. In all these cases, there's a tension between centralization and decentralization. Centralization often brings efficiency, consistency, and control, but it creates single points of failure and limits flexibility. Decentralization promotes resilience, independence, and innovation, but can lead to fragmentation or inefficiency. In the context of cryptocurrency, centralization, like we saw with Scrooge coin, makes a system vulnerable to manipulation or failure by a single party. Decentralization, on the other hand, aims to distribute control so that no single person or entity can dominate the system. This is why Bitcoin, the first widely successful cryptocurrency, was designed to be as decentralized as possible while still maintaining security and functionality. To understand how Bitcoin achieves this, let's go back to its origins. In 2008, an individual or group using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin white paper, titled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. The white paper outlined a vision for a digital currency that operates without the need for a central authority, like a bank or a figure like Scrooge. Instead, Bitcoin would rely on a peer-to-peer network, where participants, called nodes, work together to maintain the system. The goal was to create a system where digital signatures, which ensure the authenticity of transactions, could be combined with a mechanism to prevent double spending without relying on a trusted third party. Satoshi recognized that while digital signatures solve part of the problem, verifying that a transaction is legitimate, the real challenge is ensuring that everyone agrees on the state of the ledger without a central coordinator. So, what does it mean to have a decentralized ledger? In a centralized system like Scrooge Coin, one entity maintains the ledger and decides which transactions are valid. In a decentralized system, there's no single ledger keeper. Instead, every participant in the network, every node, has a copy of the blockchain, which is the ledger of all transactions. But this raises some critical questions. Who maintains the ledger if there's no central authority? Who decides which transactions are valid? Where do new coins come from? How do the rules of the system evolve? And how do we agree on the value of the currency? These are the challenges of decentralization, and Bitcoin addresses them through a combination of clever technology and incentives. Let's start with the network itself. Bitcoin operates as a peer-to-peer network, meaning there's no central server or coordinator. Anyone can join the network by running a Bitcoin node, which is software that validates transactions and maintains a copy of the blockchain. Setting up a node is relatively straightforward. You can run one on your home computer with modest hardware. This openness makes the network highly decentralized, as there's no gatekeeper controlling who can participate. However, not all aspects of Bitcoin are equally decentralized. For example, while anyone can run a node, the process of mining, creating new blocks and earning new Bitcoins is more centralized in practice. We'll dive into mining in more detail later, but for now, know that miners use specialized hardware to solve complex mathematical problems, and those with the most computational power have a better chance of success. This has led to a concentration of mining power among a few large players, creating some centralization in that aspect of the system. To make decentralization work, Bitcoin relies on something called a distributed consensus protocol. Imagine a network of thousands of nodes, each with its own copy of the blockchain. These nodes don't need to reveal their identities, and they can join or leave the network at any time. Some nodes might be faulty, providing incorrect data, while others might be outright malicious, trying to disrupt the system. The goal of a distributed consensus protocol is to ensure that all honest nodes, those following the rules, agree on the same version of the blockchain, even in the presence of faulty or malicious nodes. This agreement or consensus must meet a few key requirements. It must terminate, meaning the process of reaching agreement must eventually complete. All honest nodes must agree on the same ledger, and that ledger must contain valid transactions generated by honest nodes. Let's break down how this works in Bitcoin. Suppose Alice wants to send Bob 1 Bitcoin. She creates a transaction, signs it with her private key to prove it's legitimate, and broadcasts it to the network. Every node that receives this transaction checks its validity, ensuring Alice has the funds and the signature is correct, and then passes it along to other nodes. This process, called gossiping, ensures the transaction spreads across the network. Each node maintains two key things: a copy of the blockchain, which is the official record of all confirmed transactions, and a transaction pool, or mempool, which is a list of unconfirmed transactions waiting to be added to the blockchain. Because transactions propagate through the network at different speeds, the mempool can vary significantly between nodes. One node might know about Alice's transaction but not Carol's, while another node might have the opposite information. The challenge is deciding which transactions get added to the blockchain, given that nodes have different views of the mempool. A naive approach might be to have all nodes vote every 10 minutes on which transactions to include. If more than 50% of nodes agree a transaction is valid, it gets added. But this approach has several problems. First, there's no universal clock in a decentralized network. Nodes might disagree on when 10 minutes have passed. Second, the network is imperfect. Some nodes might be offline and others might be malicious, spamming the network with invalid transactions to waste resources. Third, and most critically, this approach is vulnerable to a Sybil attack. In a Sybil attack, a malicious actor, like Eve, creates many fake nodes to gain disproportionate influence. If Eve controls more than half the nodes, she could manipulate the vote to exclude valid transactions or include invalid ones. This problem of reaching consensus in a decentralized network with potentially malicious actors is known as the Byzantine generals problem. Imagine a group of generals surrounding a city trying to coordinate an attack. They can only communicate by messenger, but some generals might be traitors who tamper with messages. The challenge is to agree on a time to attack, even if some messages are unreliable. In Bitcoin, the equivalent is agreeing on which transactions to include in the blockchain, even if some nodes are dishonest. The difficulty lies in the lack of a centralized authority to enforce agreement or timing. As the saying goes, a man with one watch knows what time it is, but a man with two watches is never sure. In a decentralized network, every node has its own watch, making coordination tricky. To address these challenges, Bitcoin uses a consensus mechanism that avoids relying on simple voting. Instead, it employs a system where nodes collect transactions into blocks, and one node is periodically selected to propose its block to the network. Other nodes verify the block's transactions, and if they're valid, they accept the block by including its hash in their next block, creating a chain of blocks, hence the term blockchain. This process ensures that the network builds on a single agreed-upon chain. However, selecting which node gets to propose a block is a critical issue. If it's purely random, a malicious node could be chosen and propose an invalid block or exclude certain transactions. Worse, a Sybil attack could flood the network with malicious nodes, increasing the chance of a bad actor being selected. Let's consider a simplified version of Bitcoin's consensus mechanism. Imagine transactions are broadcast to all nodes, and each node collects them into a block. Periodically, a random node is chosen to broadcast its block. Other nodes check the block's transactions, and if they're valid, they accept it by linking to it in their next block. This approach assumes that Sybil attacks are mitigated, but even if a malicious node is selected, the worst it can do is propose an invalid block or exclude some transactions. Honest nodes would reject an invalid block, and the next honest node selected would include any missed transactions. This system prevents malicious nodes from forging transactions, as only the owner of a coin's private key can create a valid transaction. However, this simplified approach still has vulnerabilities, particularly around double spending. Suppose Alice sends Bob 1 Bitcoin to buy software. An honest node includes this transaction in a block, and Bob, seeing it confirmed, delivers the software. But if Alice's node is selected to propose the next block, she could choose to ignore the block containing her transaction to Bob and instead create a new block that sends the same Bitcoin to another address she controls. This creates a fork in the blockchain, one branch where Bob received the Bitcoin and another where Alice kept it. Other nodes must now choose which branch to build on, creating uncertainty. If they choose Alice's branch, Bob loses out and Alice effectively double spends her Bitcoin. To mitigate this, Bitcoin introduces a key rule. Nodes should wait for several blocks to be added after a transaction before considering it confirmed. In Bitcoin, the convention is to wait for 6 blocks, which are generated roughly every 10 minutes. The more blocks added after a transaction, the harder it is for a malicious actor to create an alternative chain that excludes or alters it. This is because creating a valid block in Bitcoin requires significant computational effort, thanks to a mechanism called proof of work, which we'll cover in detail in a future video. For now, understand that proof of work makes it costly and difficult to produce blocks, so an attacker would need immense resources to create a longer alternative chain that other nodes would accept. Let's revisit the storage implications of decentralization. In a centralized system, only one entity or a few backups needs to store the ledger. In Bitcoin, every node stores a full copy of the blockchain, which can be tens or hundreds of gigabytes. As of now, the Bitcoin blockchain is stored on tens of thousands of nodes worldwide, requiring significant storage and bandwidth. This redundancy is a trade-off. It ensures no single point of failure, but increases the resources needed to participate. It's a stark contrast to a centralized system, where a single server might suffice. Another challenge is ensuring that the system remains decentralized while still incentivizing honest behavior. In our simplified consensus model, we assume that at least half the nodes are honest and that Sybil attacks are impossible. In reality, neither assumption holds perfectly. Bitcoin addresses this through proof of work, which requires nodes to expend computational resources to propose blocks, making Sybil attacks costly. Additionally, Bitcoin uses incentives like mining rewards, newly minted Bitcoins, and transaction fees to encourage honest nodes to participate and maintain the network's integrity. Let's explore the double spending problem in more detail. In our example, Alice's attempt to double spend relied on her node being selected to propose a block, allowing her to create a fork. In Bitcoin, the selection process isn't purely random. It's tied to proof of work, where nodes compete to solve a cryptographic puzzle. The first node to solve it gets to propose the next block. This competition ensures that creating a block is resource intensive, so an attacker like Alice would need significant computational power to consistently propose blocks and sustain a fork. The 6-block confirmation rule further reduces this risk, as an attacker would need to outpace the entire network's honest nodes for an extended period to rewrite the blockchain. Now, let's consider the broader implications of decentralization. By removing a central authority, Bitcoin empowers users to control their own funds without relying on banks or governments. This aligns with the vision of a peer-to-peer electronic cash system that Satoshi Nakamoto described. However, decentralization comes with trade-offs. The lack of a central coordinator makes the system slower and less efficient than centralized alternatives. Transaction confirmation times can vary, and the network can become congested if many transactions are pending. Additionally, the decentralized nature of Bitcoin makes it harder to update the protocol. While anyone can propose changes, getting the majority of nodes to adopt them requires community consensus, which can be slow and contentious. Another aspect to consider is the role of miners. While anyone can mine Bitcoin, the process is computationally intensive, requiring specialized hardware. This has led to the rise of large mining pools, which control a significant portion of the network's computational power. While the Bitcoin network as a whole remains decentralized, mining centralization introduces some risks. If a few large miners collude, they could potentially influence which transactions are included or attempt to rewrite the blockchain. However, the economic incentives and the difficulty of coordinating such an attack make this unlikely in practice. Let's also touch on the software that powers Bitcoin. The most widely used implementation is Bitcoin Core, which runs on the vast majority of nodes, probably over 98%. While anyone can write alternative software, such as Bitcoin Knots or libitcoin, the dominance of Bitcoin Core introduces a degree of centralization in the development process. If a bug or vulnerability is found in Bitcoin Core, it could affect most of the network. This highlights that even in a decentralized system, there are points of centralization that require careful management. As we wrap up, let's reflect on what decentralization achieves. It creates a system where no single entity can control or censor transactions, making it resilient to attacks or failures. It empowers users to participate in a trustless environment, where they don't need to rely on a bank or government to verify transactions. But it also introduces complexity, resource demands, and potential vulnerabilities like Sybil attacks or mining centralization. In our next video, we'll dive into proof of work and proof of stake, the mechanisms that make decentralized consensus possible while addressing these challenges. We'll explore how mining works, how rewards incentivize honest behavior, and how Bitcoin protects against attacks like double spending. Thank you so much for joining me today on this exploration of decentralization. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into blockchain fundamentals. Let me know in the comments what you think about decentralization or if there's a specific topic you'd like us to cover next. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next video.